Welcome to the London Luminaries lecture series, 12 historic organisations working together collaboratively to share our heritage. It's lovely to have you with us this evening. My name is Rachel Morrison and I'm from Marble Hill, and I am the host for this evening. So I get the very greatest of pleasure to welcome our chair for this evening. She's a fantastic trustee of Pope's Grotto. It's Angela Kidner.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to those of you who are joining us live and to those of you who are watching us on the YouTube channel. Thank you for the introduction, Rachel. It's an honour to stand in as chair, though Judith is a hard act to follow. Even with all her myriad skills, interviewing herself might be a challenge too far. Thanks are owed to you both and to Chris, Robert and Ricky and all those behind the scenes who have made this series possible. And also to you, our audience, who have, through your donations, supported the work of our historic locations. We all have reason to be grateful to the Lottery Fund, but it is the ongoing support of you and our visitors that keeps us afloat. This lecture series builds on the success of previous series, Twickenham Luminaries and Thames Luminaries, recordings of which are all available on Marble Hill House's YouTube channel. For those of you who haven't visited one of our lectures before, why is it called the Luminaries? This area of the river, known as the Arcadian Thames, was a magnet for creative and influential people, especially in the 18th century, due to its proximity to London, which was increasing in resources as the centre of an expanding empire. The river, between the palaces of Hampton Court and Richmond, attracted royalty, aristocrats, artists, writers, and wealthy property owners. The legacy of the Luminaries was a rich tapestry of connections of poets, painters, politicians and princes that made this area the place to be. We will be exploring these riches further in a talk about Twickenhamshire as part of the Richmond Literary Festival on the 11th of November. Do please see our website, London Luminaries, for more details of this and of any of our other talks. And so now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Judith Hawley. She is a professor of 18th century literature at Royal Holloway. Her talk today builds on her role as one of the trustees of Pope's Grotto Preservation Trust.
My talk is about poetry, painting, and Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope, I hope you'll know as a really important 18th century writer, mostly of poetry. He was a very painterly poet and also much depicted by painters. He also numbered painters among his friends, including Sir Godfrey Kneller and Charles Jervas. His villa in Twickenham was lavishly decorated with portraits, mostly of his friends who were all luminaries or very famous, glowing people. And he also painted pictures in words. Many of his most famous poems, including the Dunciad and the Rape of the Lock, are intensely visual. What I'm going to concentrate on in this talk is the connections between Pope and the two painters I mentioned, Kneller and Jervis, and also look at one particular poem, an epistle to a lady, as a tour of a virtual picture gallery. Pope's villa, which you might well know, which no longer exists, but you might well know from images such as these, was built on the banks of the Thames at Twickenham. And it was largely built with the profits of his translations of Homer's Iliad, which brought in around £5,000, which in today's money is well over £500,000, so not bad for a poet. Both the villa and his association of Homer are part of his personae, and indeed part of his kind of iconography. The way in which he's depicted very often reflects this classical origin, this classical connection, and also his London position, close to London. Here he is in a portrait as quite a young man by Godfrey Kneller. And you can see that he's pensive. He's resting his elbow actually on a copy of his Homer. His dress is important too as part of this depiction. Normally men in the 18th century wore wigs when they were being formal and when they're in public. But here he is in private in the privacy of his study. He's deep in thought. So he's wearing a loose robe and a beautiful silky cap. If I had to work from home in this garment, I would be blimmin' lucky. It also depicts him as a gentleman. So his work, his social status are all part of this iconography of the choice of clothes. And his eyes looking up as if for inspiration, are much remarked on by numerous people who painted him and knew him, that he was very often deeply in thought, but also very often in pain. He suffered from various physical disabilities, including a curvature of the spine, which constricted the blood supply to his head and left him very often suffering from headache. So there's a sense that he's struggling, physically struggling to have his thoughts. The artist here is Sir Godfrey Kneller, a German writer who came to Britain in the 17th century, and he was appointed as principal painter in the court of William and Mary in 1688, the year that Pope was born. He lived at Witton House, and in a house now known as Kneller Hall, though very little of the original building survives, and Kneller Hall has recently been acquired by our friends at Radnor House School. He was a member of the Whig Kit Kat Club, and in fact he invented a painting format known as the Kit Kat portrait. It's this sort of particular format which allows the artist to depict the face of the sitter, but also their hands. As you saw in the picture of Pope, the hands and the sort of upper body are often displaying what the painter is known for, his books, the tools of his trade. And here, this is Kneller portraying himself. This is his self-portrait in this wonderfully flamboyant, fescue of beautiful lavender silk, and this big gold swag with a medal on it, which I presume is his sign of his office as court painter, and with his beloved house in the background. Kneller was something of a luminary in Twickenham. He held a lot of sort of serious public offices. He was a church warden of St Mary's, was responsible partly for the rebuilding of that church, and a justice of the peace. He also taught Charles Jervas, the other painter that I mentioned. So he was really quite a big cheese in the area. Alexander Pope commissioned Kneller to paint various portraits, including one of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. Now, this image appears online as Lady Mary by Kneller. I'm not 100% certain that it is. I'm going to show you some images later which are better attested. But Lady Mary Wortley Montagu is a wonderful woman in her own right, a writer, wit, famous beauty, introduced inoculation into Britain, and quite famously went to Turkey on a trip with her husband and came back with this amazing Turkish costume, a whole variety of Turkish costumes, which she wore quite regularly in society. And Pope commissioned this portrait and then immediately supposedly wrote these lines on the portrait, impromptu. He's inspired by the painting to produce his own writing about the painting. And the lines basically say, I can't paint her in words. I can't do this amazing woman justice. You have done that in your print. At this stage, around 1720, when Pope first moved to Twickenham and built his villa, encouraged Lady Mary to rent a villa from Kneller. Lady Mary and Pope were incredibly close friends. They had a disastrous falling out, and she is one of the women satirized in his epistle to a lady later on. But even so, he kept his portrait of Lady Mary until he died. So there's something about the portrait that says something about maybe his aspirations for the relationship, something about the portrait that really meant something to him, even though his relations with her are completely broken down. As court painter, Kneller painted a lot of famous men and women, and he painted a series known as the Hampton Court Beauties, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But first of all, I want to show you another image of Pope by his other great painter friend, Charles Jervas. So this is a portrait earlier than the Pope portrait that we saw by Kneller, by Jervis, and he's in this wonderful flame-coloured chair, again with his hand on his head, supporting the weight of his thoughts, supporting the weight of his physically painful head perhaps, and deep in contemplation. There's a mysterious figure behind her. I can't quite tell. She seems to be fetching a book from the shelves behind. Is she dusting the shelves, or is she a muse? I don't know. Is she a muse maid? It's hard to say. Jervis was a big friend of Pope, and he also became court painter after Kneller. But he's probably overrated. His art really isn't much talked about nowadays, and I'm not surprised really that Kneller thought ill of his former pupil. And apparently, upon being told that Jervis had married a wealthy widow, had set up a carriage with 4 horses, Kneller replied, "Ach, mein Gott, if his horses do not draw better than he does, he will never get to his journey's end." But he was a very talented artist and also talented at friendship. And even though he was associated with Pope, who was probably a Tory and a Catholic and became very much part of the opposition, Jervis managed to stay in popularity with the regime of Robert Walpole. It's funny, the accommodation seems to be tied up with both these writers. So Kneller provided a house for Lady Mary. Charles Jervas, who had rooms overlooking St. James's Palace in Cleveland Court, was Pope's London home, and he regularly stayed with him when he was up in town. He spent about 6 months with Jervis in 1713, apparently studying painting. None of his paintings survive, and Pope talks about himself being a very bad painter. The influence worked both ways. As well as Jervis teaching Pope painting and about painting, Pope advised him on some of the literary works that Jervis produced, including a translation of a treatise on the art of painting. Pope also asked Jervis to paint a portrait of 2 of his favourite women, the sisters Martha and Teresa Blunt. They were part of the Catholic milieu that Pope moved in, and they're depicted here. On the left is Martha and on the right is Teresa. And Jervis wrote a letter to Pope telling him that he just finished this painting, and he used rather literary terms. "I've just set my last hand to a couplet, for so I may call my 2 nymphs in one piece. They are Pope's favourites, and therefore your guess must have cost me more pains than any nymphs can be worth. He has been so unreasonable to expect that I should have made them as beautiful upon canvas as he has done upon paper." So now Jervis is saying that Pope's word paintings are more beautiful than his actual paintings. There is something though in the way that Jervis has captured their characters that's important here. So Martha on the left, her blonde hair blowing in the wind, not looking directly at the viewer, but looking at her sister in a slightly nervous way, perhaps, whereas Teresa, dark-haired Teresa, looking directly at the viewer, quite bold. And Pope was at first attracted to Teresa for her boldness, her forthrightness. He did like strong women, but then very often, as he did with Lady Mary, he went off them. He found them too strong. And he depicted both Lady Mary and Teresa in poetry as being like the sun with an intense glare that he just couldn't face. Whereas Martha he depicted as being like the moon, having this reflected glow. And I think he liked her because she reflected his own light back at him. Here, both sisters were still very close friends with Pope, and they seem perhaps to be fashioning him a wreath of olives to crown him with. Jervis is using these 2 women and also the letter describing them to make a comment on what were often known as the sister arts, poetry and painting. I mentioned that Pope helped him with his translation of a treatise called The Art of Painting by the French painter and writer Charles Jervas. In it, Fresnoy says in Jervis's words, "Painting and poesy are 2 sisters, which are so like in all things, they mutually lend each other both name and office. One is called dumb poesy and the other a speaking picture." So they swap characteristics between them. This back and forth is something that Pope talks about a lot in his writings on poetry and painting. So Pope published a poem to Jervis as a sort of preface to Jervis's translations of Dryden's translation of Fresnoy's The Art of Painting. Lots of sort of complicated titles there, and this is a long quotation. But I just want to point out a little couplet here in the middle of this long poem, that Pope describes his friendship with Jervis in this terms: "Smit with the love of sister arts we came, and met congenial, mingling flame with flame. Like friendly colours, found them both unite." So poetry and painting are sister arts, and he also is in love with both sisters And the two writers and painters, Pope and Jervis, are friends with each other, who also take pleasure in offering critiques of each other's work. They look at each other's works and they find something to blame and something to commend. And the spirit of blame, commendation, is something that you find a lot in Pope's writing, especially in his satires. It's going to become an important theme in his Epistle to a Lady. Let me just pick up on one more point about the relationship between words and images, and also to draw on the classical background, as we did with Homer. Horace has a phrase in his Art of Poetry called Ars Poetica, ut pictura poesis, a poem is like a picture. And it's often taken out of context to say that the poems are, paint a picture in words. Poetry is a visual medium. But actually, it's a phrase that in context means something slightly different. Horace actually declared, a poem is like a picture. One strikes your fancy more the nearer you stand, another the farther away. This courts the shade, that wishes to be seen in light. She's not saying that poems are all visual, but that like pictures, some of them are better close up and some further away. Some are better when you read them in great detail, and others when you get the general gist. But this idea that poetry and painting are basically doing the same thing, giving a representation of the world, became something of an adage, if not a total cliche, in the 18th century. Another term, the summer Greek term, is also important here. The Epistle to a Lady is what we can call an ekphrasis, and that's a kind of poem which in itself constitutes a vivid description of a real or an imaginary work of art. So the poem is painting a picture of a painting. Now, Pope wrote a number of what are called moral epistles, letters in verse to various friends. And the one I'm going to discuss is the one called Epistle to a Lady. It's addressed to Martha Blunt, but he doesn't anywhere name Martha Blunt. She is sort of in the shade. She doesn't want to be in the light. She lives a sort of private life, which he thought was appropriate for women. The poem begins with an argument, and an argument is kind of a prose summary of what the poem is going to be about. And I'll just pick out a few of the things. You'll see straight away the Pope is speaking very much in the idiom of his time, and what he says about women would be extremely offensive nowadays. But in fact, I think it was offensive then, and women did get really annoyed by what he had said. And he begins with a bold declaration that the particular characters of women are not so strongly marked as those of men, seldom so fit, and still more inconsistent with themselves. So women are kind of wobbly. They're not very strong, they're weak. And he's going to paint their characters where they seem to be a little bit stronger. He runs through 7 different types, including the affected, the soft-natured, the cunning and artful, and on to the stupid and simple. Yeah, I'm not terribly keen on this. And he ends with a portrait of Martha in the form of the picture of an estimable woman with the best of contrarieties. So she's a mixed bag, but she takes the best of all the types and she balances them out. And as I said, the poem did offend people, and there were women writers who wrote responses to it, defending women against the charges that he made. The poem isn't just a verbal description of one picture, it's actually a tour of a picture gallery, and it takes as its starting point, rather strangely and surprisingly, something that Martha Blunt is supposed to say. So he claims, I'm not just dissing women, I'm just picking up on something that you yourself, Martha, said. Nothing so true as what you once let fall. Most women have no characters at all. Matter too soft, a lasting mark to bear, and best distinguished by black, brown, or fair. So his image is of molten wax that in the 18th century would be used to seal a letter. So you'd melt some wax, and you take your seal, your signet ring, and you would impress a mark in it. And as the wax cools, the mark would be left as a kind of character, stamping out the identity of the woman. But women are too soft, they're wobbly, they're like jelly or custard. And so you sort of press them, you try to put a stamp on them, but they just kind of, wibble wobble about. The only way you can tell them apart is by the colour of their hair. Whether they got black hair, brown hair, or like Martha, fair hair. Not very comfortable with this. So then he takes this as the starting point and takes us on a tour of a picture gallery where women would be depicted in different characters, not just one character, because they don't just have one character. So he takes us to the picture gallery. How many pictures of one nymph with view, and how unlike each other, all how true. Arcadia's countess here in ermined pride is there Pastora by a fountainside. Here Fania leering on her own good man, and there a naked leader with a swan. Let then the fair one beautiful cry in Magdalen's loose hair and lifted eye, or dressed in smiles of sweet Cecilia shine, with simpering angels, palms and harps divine. Whether the charmer sin it or saint it, if folly grow romantic, I must paint it. Although it's rather different, you know, we have to bear in mind that nowadays people do curate their own images, don't they? I mean, the selfies, the Instagram portraits, the showing themselves in their best light, and also showing themselves in a variety of different personae. And here saying that a noblewoman might commission a portrait of herself as the Countess of Arcadia, or as a pastoral nymph, or as Leda, as in Leda and the Swan, or as Magdalene or Saint Cecilia. It's sort of, what's the fashionable image? What has Lady so-and-so just been painted as? I want one just like that. And the artists would readily oblige, and they often kept in their studios the right costumes for women to dress themselves up in. I mentioned before that Godfrey Kneller painted a series of portraits known as the Hampton Court Beauties. There are 8 of them, and they're commissioned by Queen Mary, and they're portraits of her ladies in waiting and other attendants. And they would have been displayed like this. This isn't in Hampton Court, but this corridor of paintings, I can't quite tell if these are the Hampton Court Beauties or if they also include another set by one of Kneller's predecessors, Sir Peter Lilly, who painted the Windsor Beauties for Charles II. And Charles II was a much more flamboyant prince and much more sexually profligate, and his women were much less respectable than the Protestant ladies and the solid wigs that Mary and William tried to attract around them. But we imagine ourselves strolling through Pope's poem as if we're looking in the picture gallery and seeing these portraits. And the kind of thing we see in the poem, as in the Windsor Beauties, would be, say, Barbara Villiers, the Countess of Castlemaine, here depicted as Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. But in the next picture, as Madonna. So she's sainting it, as Pope puts it here, as the Virgin Madonna, but her child is not baby Jesus, but it's one of her several illegitimate sons by Charles II. So she's adopting these different guises, and this gives Pope some heft, some purchase, when he claims that women like to dress up in different guises. Let's look at the first pair of portraits in Pope's poems. He has 2 women here that he's contrasting. One he calls Rufa and one he calls Sappho. So he's not using the women's real names, but he's using sort of pen names, nicknames, satirical names for them. Rufa, whose eye, quick glancing o'er the park, attracts each light gay meteor of a spark, agrees as ill with Rufa studying lock as Sappho's diamonds with her dirty smock, or Sappho at her toilet's greasy task, with Sappho fragrant at an evening mask. So morning insects that in muck begun shine, buzz and flybow in the setting sun. So imagining a red-haired woman, Rufa, perhaps Lady Sheffield, who in the morning go to St. James's Park and flirt. She casts her eye about all on the handsome young men there. But then later on in the day, she reads the treatises of the philosopher John Locke, and those 2 portraits don't seem to square with each other. Or Sappho, who wears beautiful diamonds, but has a dirty undergarment, a dirty smock. Or in the evening, she's painting her face with sort of dirty white lead and mouse skin stuck on eyebrows and other disgusting things. But then she goes to an evening party, a mask, a dressing up party, a masquerade party, where she looks absolutely glorious. And this is like you find in nature, that in the morning flies hatch from maggots laid in dung, and then by the evening they're beautiful butterflies or flies with beautiful gilded wings. It's pretty unpleasant, this idea that women they can't combine intellectual properties and beauty, or that even when they are beautiful, they disgust men. And it's very likely that Pope actually had Lady Mary Wortley Montagu in mind when he's talking about Sappho. He satirized her repeatedly under the pen name Sappho. And here she is in one of her sort of masquerade costumes, one of her Turkish costumes. There's some truth to the suggestion that she had a dirty smock or her toilette was greasy. Horace Walpole met her in 1740 and describes her as being a bit of a mess. But it's also a standard kind of insult on a learned woman that she's so busy reading her books that she doesn't care for her personal appearance. And clearly, you know, on the one hand, men are disgusted when women are messy, but on the other hand, they're criticized if they spend too much time paying attention to their appearance. They can't win either way. So here's one of the images of Lady Mary in her Turkish costume. And here are two of her by, and that one was by Jervis, and there are two by Kneller. Now I can't find a color image of the one on the left. This is her in her Turkish costume, and it might well be the one that Pope commissioned. I don't know. And on the right, she looks as if she's sainting it. She's in a very, very plain costume, very clean plain costume, with her finger in a book. Maybe it's a book of devotion or it's a book of learning. She was one of the best read women in all of Britain. And these are images which portray her in a very good light. And I think most people saw her in this good light in her early years, but she came to be depicted as this kind of rather disgusting old woman led by her passions later on, which I think is quite unfair. And we can talk about this more in questions. I want to end with one more portrait of somebody that you might well know from other luminaries and other talks that we've done in our series. And that is Henrietta Howard. And this is a painting by Charles Jervas. Another of Pope's portraits in his sort of bitch fest, the Epistle to a Lady, is of Chloe. And he imagines Martha saying, but surely Chloe was formed without a spot. She's pure. And Pope says, well, yes, she's pure, but she's heartless. She's an empty shell. So very reasonable, so unmoved, as never yet to love or to be loved. She, while her lover pants upon her breast, can mark the figures on an Indian chest. And when she sees her friend in deep despair, observes how much a chintz exceeds mohair. Now, some people say that this is an image of Henrietta Howard, the Countess of Suffolk, mistress of George II, Pope's good friend at Marble Hill. And it's possible. She's known to be very reasonable. She's known also to be very phlegmatic and unmoved, partly because she was partly deaf and possibly couldn't hear you if you said something nasty about her. But this idea of her as this sort of heartless woman who is so inattentive while she's actually making love that she's busy looking at the furniture of the bedroom, looking at the Japan chest or thinking about fabric is really offensive, I think, and deliberately so. What it suggests to me is, yes, that Pope is trying to offend, but also that his verbal portraits, like this painted portrait by Charles Jervas, are not photographic images. They're not realistic depictions. There isn't a position on which, you know, anybody could sit and see Marble Hill in the background like this. It's a constructed portrait, and a lot of Jervis's portraits have a signature sort of silhouette. He liked to paint women in this kind of not quite hourglass figure. It's an elongated hourglass figure with a long torso. It's almost like they've got a couple of extra vertebrae to elongate the spine. It was a kind of image that he liked. Peter Lilly always seemed to paint his women looking like King Charles spaniels with bug eyes and big curly hair. It was the fashion of the time. So Pope's satirical portraits are kind of the opposite of idealizing, but they are manufactured constructions. He's learnt from painters to create something which is a composite, which is elusive, and many layered, that gives you an image of how people saw people at the time, but without being kind of photographic. He did like to surround himself with images, and this is my very last point. He was very proud of his villa, as Henrietta Howard was. You see that she has her villa in the background of this portrait. He liked to be seen in relation to his villa. And the inside of his villa was practically a picture gallery. His walls were kind of a mosaic of paintings. An inventory was taken of the property he had at his death. And he was found to own 56 portraits, some other landscapes and various other kinds of things, but 56 portraits, mostly of his friends. All of these portraits, along with the contents of the villa and the villa himself, he bequeathed on his death to his dear friend, Martha Patty Blunt. This is our last in the current series, Sad Face. But if you come back in January and February next year, we have a lovely collection of different houses, including Marble Hill House. If you would like to donate, we should have a thing set up saying text Pope to Pope's Grotto, and you'll give us shed loads of money. £5,000 would be nice. If you'd like to get more directly involved, we're always recruiting volunteers, and go to our website and you'll find out more information. Thank you very much.